We are opening now the panel on the Jewish child during the Holocaust, New Perspectives in Research. As we all know, right after the Holocaust, we could already find literary works, plays, diaries, movies even, dealing with the Jewish children in the Holocaust. This is a very emotional subject, very touching subject, and naturally there was a lot of material out there, and also people would like to read it. What we were lacking in the first decades after the Holocaust is research. Do we have research on children during the Holocaust, on the experiences of Jewish children during the Holocaust, on policies relating to Jewish children during the Holocaust? This is we are seeing now in the last decade and a half, and we are also having a panel with new research right off from the historian studio. We will have two outstanding researchers, Dr. Verena Buser and Professor Joanna Michlic. We will start with a presentation by Dr. Verena Buser on tagging children and teenagers during the Holocaust on the Yellow Star. Dr. Verena Buser is a Holocaust historian based in Berlin. Her research work was awarded fellowships by the Leo Baeck Institute New York and by the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture. Her areas of research include childhood and youth during and after the Holocaust, Hachshara and non-Zionist immigration, preparation, Jewish functionaries in the camps, and most important for me, she is my colleague in the project Children of War, Holocaust and Genocide. Currently, she's the curator of the exhibition Fates of Children of the Lost Transport with Thomas Irmer of Berlin, a touring exhibition about children's perspective on the Death March events and the aftermath of the Holocaust. Dr. Verena Buser, please.
I would like to say thank you to the organizers, especially Madine, who invited me to speak today at this very, very interesting event. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very honored to speak today at the occasion of the 25th anniversary of Yad LaYeled. So I will present you a little about my research about Jewish children and teenagers during the Holocaust, with a focus on the Jewish children and teenagers tagged with the Yellow Star. I will start with a quote. "We already know the course of events, the criminal facts, the types of murder from the testimonies of adults," end quote. These words by survivor historian Ginia Silkes from a publication after the war's end about the imperative to select and preserve the children's memories is true for many events during the Holocaust. Meanwhile, there exists, for example, several studies about children's experiences in camps or ghettos. Other publications are based on ego documents of former child survivors. Regardless of their actual experiences, the cause of the events which influenced children's lives dramatically was dependent on the place where a child actually lived, the time when the Germans or the collaborators' terror started, and the implementation of the German occupation policy against Jews. When it comes to the question what it meant to wear the yellow star as a child under Nazi rule, it is obvious that the marking of Jewish women, men, and children and teenagers in the public spaces of occupied Europe occurred in stages, starting in Poland right after the invasion of the country. And now I share my PowerPoint with you. Yes. The tagging with the yellow star was only one part of a wider and systematic annihilation policy against the Jewish child. Depending on the location and respective occupation policy, the star marked the beginning or the end point of Germany's anti-Jewish legislation. Thus, Polish Jewish children from 6 years onwards were the first to be marked in September 1939. This measure was overshadowed by the immediate occupation of the country, the implementation of a racist policy, and first shootings and killings of Jews of the Einsatzgruppen. We have a great number of accounts with regards to everyday life of children in Poland. Most of you will be familiar with stories of girls or boys lurking or taking off the star from clothing and sneaking from a ghetto onto the Aryan side for providing food or other things for their families and friends. On a psychosocial level, the implementation of the yellow star meant to a Polish child in reality the rapid, brutal and unforeseeable change of its life. Heinrich Demerer and his memories were just recently published by Yad Vashem. He was born in Sosnowiec, which was located in the so-called Oststreifen, was 9 years old when he was forced to wear the star. But it was not only the stigma which confused the boy, far more it were the social consequences. I quote him, "Something very bad has happened. From tomorrow, all Jews, including me, must wear a yellow star on their clothing." Just why? What have we done about being treated like this? We are just like everyone else. The mother has sewn a yellow star to my suits and has strictly forbidden me to go to the streets without the star tomorrow. I cannot believe that the Germans should have ordered. The ones I have met so far were not like that. End quote. After Poland in 1939, then those children and teens in Croatia, Serbia, for example, Latvia followed. Also, children in Luxembourg had to wear it from July 1941 onwards. But here it was a little bit different. They had to wear a yellow armband, which was followed by a star in October of the same year. Thus, dependent on the different stages of the Holocaust, this time-shifting frame has a decisive influence onto the testimonies of child or teenage survivors, and logically, in a second step, onto our today's knowledge about children wearing the star. Meanwhile, to Jewish children in Germany or Austria, annexed Austria, this marking or tagging occurred only at the final stage on the eve of mass deportations to their deaths in September 1941 and parallel to first mass gassings in Auschwitz. And I quote survivor Ruth Klüger with the following words: "Even before the star, everything imaginable was close to Jews, forbidden, inaccessible. Jews and dogs were unwanted everywhere. Most of us who wore the star think they should have worn it much earlier. That is because the exclusion of Jews was already in full swing before September 1941. I cannot say that I did not like wearing it, this Jewish star. Under the circumstances, it seemed appropriate, if already, then already," end quote. So to children living in Germany and those in Austria or the Protectorate Bohemia and Moravia were concerned by this humiliating measure only later than those children in Poland, 7 weeks before the deportations into the extermination camps in Eastern Europe started. When these deportations started from Germany, there were only a few children left in Nazi Germany. Those who stayed behind found themselves in a process of marking without the star, exclusion from social surroundings and everyday discrimination from former friends and neighbors. Flight and Aliyah B were a last chance to escape. If we have a closer look on the quote of Ruth Klüger, she spoke about the full swing against the Jewish population. We have to attest, and I take an example from Nazi Germany. Up until February 1945, alone 962 laws and orders were published against the Jewish population in Germany. Even though there were only a few orders which aimed at children or teenagers as such, it was different for the children, because especially to them, the exclusion from social relationships was no. Their exclusion from social relationship was a very important part in their education, which was missing now. Testimonies of child survivors from Germany emphasize that the process of separation, I mentioned it already before, began already in 1933. And also Anne Frank in the Netherlands reported in her world-famous diary, I quote her, "From May 1940, the good times went downhill. First the war, then the surrender, the German invasion, and the misery for us Jews began. Jewish laws followed Jewish law, and our freedom was restricted. Jews must wear a Jewish star, Jews have to hand in their bicycles, Jews are not allowed to drive a car, Jews allowed to shop only from 3 to 5 o'clock, and so on and so on. Jews are not allowed in swimming pools, field hockey fields, or other athletic fields. So our lives went on and we were not allowed to do this and that," end quote. Developmental psychology of childhood taught us that children build relationships with other children and their teachers and educators. They learn to be part of a community, the individual areas, kindergarten, playgrounds, family life, and more, interact with each other and form a complex whole. A separation from these surroundings was like cutting out a part from their childhood, as they were not in a position to interact actively with the environment anymore. Heinrich Demerer stated about the fact that it was all of a sudden forbidden to play with his best friend the following, I quote him, "That hit me the deepest. That was a lot worse than the thing about the star that my mother just told me about," end quote. Now, due to shrinking surroundings and adults being in a state of helplessness, the children had to rely often on themselves. I quote another Jewish boy from then. "A world collapsed in me. I do not understand anything anymore. When I went to school as usual this morning, I and a few others were sent home. Jews are no longer allowed to attend school, we were told. We looked at each other, then suddenly looked at the stars on our clothes and went home quietly. How I would have liked to get rid of this wretched star and stay in the classroom with the others. We could have had the worst teachers and worst subjects. I would not care. It's bad to be excluded," end quote. Everyday harassment, attacks after school or in school, friends who were all of a sudden not friends anymore, led to the fact that the Jewish children and teenagers were excluded from their social life and were targeted directly within their private sphere. For Jewish children, the school in National Socialist Germany, and of course in other countries too, this was a world full of dangers. The daily exclusion hit new school children and the younger children, especially because they could not oppose it yet due to their young age. Whenever possible, parents tried to protect them from these experiences and sent them to Jewish schools. It were, in my eyes, the silent, the administrative laws and orders, which are targeted also at the Jewish children. An example from the capital, Berlin, shows that in 1934, the municipality cancelled the reduced rate in school fees for children. Not all of them could attend the schools now. Jewish children were no longer permitted to attend municipal and private Aryan kindergartens. Another example, at the end of 1937, only 2,100 Jewish children were attending public schools, contrasted with more than 12,000 in May 4 years earlier. Thus, bitterly, the Jewish children from then had to experience an everyday feeling of powerlessness, and they stressed in post-war interviews or memories that they struggled with the sense of no longer being wanted and having to leave the homeland. Schools or playgrounds, for example, were spaces for Jewish children in Nazi Germany anymore. But gradually, it became more and more a challenge to participate actively in that part of German society. And then some years later, the municipality in Berlin marked benches in a dull yellow with the notice for Jews only. The same was done at children's playgrounds. Here you see an example from a playground in Poland saying only for German children on the left side. The everyday struggle for inclusion is mirrored in thousands of survivor testimonies. I quote another child from then. I sat in the corner all day today pondering. From the street, the screaming of the boys who were playing football in our square resounded as if nothing had happened. So life goes on. If I did not occasionally tease and insult some boys from the neighboring street as a Jew, I think sometimes I would not even think about it. But if it is scarcely scared, it will open up again, end quote. Finally, as we can see, the social exclusion in this case was even worse. Again, this example demonstrated this than the mer marking with the star. Jewish children and teenagers documented in diaries, also in post-war interviews and other eager documents, a variety of responses, how they avoided to wear the star. In the context of wearing it, the parents' reactions had a decisive influence on their children and their adaptation to wear it. Henny Brenner, for example, then living in Dresden in a very well-known family, remembers her mother having feelings of shame and not wanting to leave their home anymore in a state of self-imposed seclusion. But due to her father's reactions, he said, as she reported, he walked very upright, taking my mother to one side and me to the other. Henny learned to wear it with some sense of pride. For Lieselotte Clemens, on the other side, it was terrible, as she said in a post-war interview, as they never knew what would happen next. In her case, she opposed her father as she did not want to leave the house anymore with a star. Arthur von Dansky reports with regards to the so-called caretaker of the house, the so-called Hauswart, that they as children had to be careful not to meet him while they wore the star. So even though children also felt shame and anger, it seems if they also showed a large flexibility in avoiding to wear it. On the one hand, they were forced to turn to explicitly Jewish spaces. But on the other hand, the externally imposed borders for children were in many cases more flexible, as the aforementioned example demonstrated. Being not aware, the younger they were at the time, to grasp the full dimension of persecution, being dependent on their parents or other adults' reactions, and the stronger those were, they had the courage to circumvent the marking measure. I come to the conclusion now. Of course, a comprehensive examination of the reactions of children and teenagers, the youngest generation, wearing the yellow star, goes far beyond the scope of this lecture. Further research and a deeper discussion should involve a special focus on the consequences which the persecution events had on the children, on the spaces of education and schooling from their individual perspective, the youth spaces. Nevertheless, the emotional aspects and the emotional scars they sustained in finding safety and freedom, and surviving ghettos and camps were life-lasting. Many of those who were so lucky to migrate and flee abroad would endure lifelong consequences, such as the survivors' feelings of guilt for having outlived their families, friends, loved ones, children, or partners. And at the end of this lecture, I would like to dedicate this lecture to Gerd Sommerfeld, who died of corona last September 2020, and from whom I learned a lot what it meant to be a Jewish child in Nazi Berlin. Thank you for listening.
And thank you very much, Verena.
So it was shorter now. I think it's enough.
No, I think it's enough. And again, I'm listening for the second time, and it's just an incredible story that I don't think
I missed him.
We can do that over too if you want.
No, I will not give it again.
No, you don't have to give it again. All you have to do is do the last part, saying that you're dedicating it, and we will edit everything else out.
Okay, I will say it again.
You can do that.
Okay, 1, 2. What is it in Hebrew? 1, 2, 3.
Achad, Shtaim, Shalosh.
Okay, so I would like to dedicate this lecture today to Gerd Sommerfeld, who died because of corona last September 2020, because we had a lot of talks about it meant to be a Jewish child under Nazi rule in Berlin. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Verena, for this enlightening lecture. We are now passing on to our next lecture. We are having, just a minute, Professor Joanna Michlic. Now, there's a lot in my introduction of Joanna that I have to say because of all the important things she is doing and has done and has contributed to research. I'll start by something that is not written in your bio, and this is, I think, Joanna is the first researcher to really use children's testimonies to understand the experience of children during the war in Poland, to do this extensively and professionally, and we learned a lot from you, so thank you. Dr. Joanna Michlic is a social and cultural, I'm trying to close. That was for Verena. That's right. She is the founder and first director of the HBI Project on Families, Children, and the Holocaust at Brandeis University. She's an honorary senior research associate at UCL Center for the Study of Collective Violence, the Holocaust and Genocide in the UCL Institute for Advanced Studies, and she's a research fellow at the Weiss Livnat International Center for Holocaust Research and Education in the University of Haifa. She's co-editor-in-chief of Genealogy Journal. Her research focuses on social and cultural history of Poland and East European Jews, the Holocaust and its memory in Europe, East European Jewish childhood rescue and rescuers of Jews in Central Europe and anti-Semitism, racism and nationalism in Europe. She's recipient of many academic awards. I will not mention them all, and written many books. I will say that a book on the Jewish children and rescue in Poland came out in 20. I can't say the name in Polish, and her book works, Poland Strengthening Other, the image of the Jews from 1880 to the present, will appear in Hebrew translation in the spring in Yad Vashem. And she's currently working on a book project on the history and memory of rescuing Jews in Poland, More Than the Milk of Human Kindness, Jewish survivors and their Polish rescuers recount their tales, 1944-1949. Joanna, the floor is yours.
Boaz, thank you very much for this very kind introduction. And I would like to thank all the organizers for inviting me to this very important conference. As Boaz said, in my work, I have focused on the importance of voices of children in the reconstructions of everyday life during the Holocaust and also in the post-war period, and on the identity of Jewish children and also historiography. But today I would like to talk about one aspect of the history of child Holocaust survivors and their multi-generational families that perhaps we as researchers we have overlooked. So this is one particular aspect. And I will now share my screen. And let's go to slide 2. Do we get it? In her poem titled About My Father, Irena Klepfish, a poetess and Jewish child survivor from Warsaw, paints a picture of her father, Michał Klepfish, as a vital individual in her rescue from the Warsaw Ghetto. He left me on the street to be picked up by the nuns from an orphanage. He watched me from a distant doorway. The end of quotation. Examining closely the children's early and late post-war testimonies and their parents' letters from within the Holocaust, we can now definitely reevaluate the role of parents as the first crucial rescuers of their children, responsible for executing the rescue action. Only very few Jewish parents were lucky to survive with their children together or in hiding separately and rebuild their family lives intact in the aftermath of the Second World War. Some parents had hopes that they would be reunited with their children after the Holocaust, while many others knew that they were facing an ultimate death and could only attempt to safeguard a physical survival of their children. They hoped against hope that after the Holocaust their children would be united with and brought up by their surviving adult relatives in Poland or relatives abroad. This was their final will, articulated in their emotional letters written with pressing urgency. And I will give you later in my talk a gist of a couple of such letters. However, these parents' wishes rarely came to fruition. They ultimately lost control over their children's future fate in the moment of separation from them in the ghettos, labor camps, or on the Aryan side. I argued that this moment of separation in the history of Jewish family in the Holocaust is one of the most crucial aspects for understanding the possibilities and limitations of the reconstruction of Jewish family after the war, and the post-war fate and cultural identity of some child survivors. In this talk, I would like to discuss 5 different cases to show how the trajectories of Jewish children's lives unfolded after they were separated from their parents. I focus on cases showing the complexities and impossibilities of the smooth reconstruction of Jewish family after the war, the long shadow of the Holocaust cast over surviving families, and continuous presence of secrets and missing blank places of survival puzzle accompanying the lives of many child survivors. Slide 3, please. In the poignant letter of 4 June 1943, written in a small forced labor camp in Czystyłów near Tarnopol in eastern Galicia, Szymon Ginsberg addresses his 3 siblings living in Haifa, then Palestine. He informs them about the birth of his daughter Anna, born on 17 April 1943, and about Anna's rescuer, Mr. Valenty Alexander, a Pole of German origin, who smuggled the baby girl out of the forced labor camp 16 hours after her birth. Without disclosing Alexander's name, in order to protect him and his daughter, Ginsberg tells his siblings in Haifa that a Polish engineer, whom he calls an angel in a human body, had saved his newborn baby girl. At the time of writing this poignant letter, his last will, Ginsberg was fully aware that he and his wife, Zofia Distenfeld, were doomed to be murdered like the rest of their families. He realized that he would never see his baby daughter again, and his last wish was that his siblings in Haifa would take care and adopt the poor baby I leave behind in this world after the war. And I will give you citations of this letter. You see it written in beautiful Polish, here an excerpt from it on the screen. I beg you, as a man who has already crossed into the next world, I beg you from the depths of my parents' heart and my own heart that you will carry out a search for my infant girl and that you will provide her with everything that I could not, that you will become her parents. I know that you will do that. I regret and it pains me that this is inevitable. The end of quote. In her letter of 22nd July 1994, addressed to the Righteous Among the Nations sections at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, the daughter, Anna, recalls that on 18 May 1952, her adoptive father, Valenty Alexander, gave her his brief memoir in which he revealed for the first time the secrets of her personal history. And you see on the screen the testament will. This is also the work of Valenty Alexander. This is what he prepared as a part of the gift for Anna when she was 9 years old. On the day, Anna celebrated an important Christian ceremony. She underwent the Catholic rite of First Holy Communion. What one can infer from Anna's letters of 1994 is that she considered Alexander a loving, dedicated, and deeply religious parent. However, there are many aspects of Anna's personal post-war history that remain concealed and unclear, a situation not unusual in the post-war lives of some child Holocaust survivors. From another letter, deposited in the collection of Central Committee of Polish Jews at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, one learns, as Alexander declares, that out of a moral obligation, he indeed contacted Ginsburg's siblings in Haifa in the early post-war period. In fact, Alexander and a teenage Anna visited her relatives in Haifa in 1956. However, Anna didn't remain with her biological aunts and uncle in Israel, but she returned with her beloved adopted father to Poland. Apparently, she was too emotionally attached to Mr. Alexander, his wife, and their daughter Stefania to make the life-changing decision to emigrate to Israel and start life anew in a completely different culture. Yet, the representatives of the second generation of Anna's family in Haifa contacted me in 2016 after I had published one of the first articles in which I mentioned Anna's history. From their recollections filled with sorrow and disappointment, one learns that after the visit in 1956, communications were cut off between Anna and her remaining biological family in Haifa. It would be hard to establish all the reasons behind that development. Mr. Alexander passed away in 1961, and I will ask for slide 4 now, and received the title of the Righteous Among Gentiles on 16 February 1997, thanks to the efforts of his adoptive daughter, Anna. Slide number 5, please. In a short documentary called Castaways, about the so-called luggage children thrown out by their desperate parents from trains heading to Treblinka extermination center, we learn about a baby girl, Jola, who today still lives in Łapy, a small town in northeastern Poland, where she was saved during the Holocaust. Slide number 6, please. Elderly witnesses remember that the baby girl thrown out of the death train laid for some time in a ditch near the railways. They also remember her crying. A local Polish Christian family took a pity on her, took her in and brought up as their own daughter. Today, this child survivor is unable to speak about the past and her identity. Cases such as Anna's and Jola's show that the first rupture caused by the murder of biological parents was decisive for these children survivors' future lives. These children, cared and loved by the rescuer post-war adoptive parents, could not embark on a painful and terrifying journey taking them back to the Holocaust and to embrace their original Jewish identity and all the pains and fears associated with it. Today, they and their children would rather not touch upon the subject for a variety of psychological, social, and cultural reasons. They keep their dark secrets to themselves. Sadly, some are aware that their social environment, including their own spouses, parents-in-law, and even children, might not be too overjoyed with having discovered a Jew in the family. Slide number 7, please. Romualda Mansfield-Booth, born at the end of 1939 as Esther Goldstein and today a member of the Association of Child Holocaust Survivors in Poland, learned only in 1989 that her biological mother, Helen Goldstein, camped in vain through towns and villages in Volhynia for 1.5 years after the Holocaust to locate her. The Germans killed the Polish railwayman to whom Helena entrusted her blue-eyed and blonde-haired toddler sometimes in the spring of 1943. And with his death, Helena could not retrieve the next traces of her daughter's wartime and early post-war existence. Helena Goldstein passed away in Israel in 1977, not knowing that her daughter from the first marriage was alive and living in Poland. Romualda only discovered the names of her biological parents and some sketchy details of her wartime history in 1989. She learned that after her father, Jakub Goldstein, was murdered in the Bełżec death camp, her mother, pregnant with a second child and with Romualda, escaped the Brody ghetto to the Aryan side, sometimes in the early spring of 1943. She managed to safeguard a shelter for Romualda on the Aryan side and herself went into hiding with other members of her husband's family. In December 1943, around Christmas time, a childless mixed Polish-Ukrainian couple, Maria Titarenko and Mikołaj Titarenko, became Romualda's guardians. In 1946, with the strict Polish mother, Romualda began a new life journey to Żary, near Żagań in Silesia, in the first repatriation transport from the east. In 2019 interview, Romualda speaks with sadness about her lack of memories and knowledge of any Jewish organization searching for her in the early post-war period. Her reunion of 1989 with the second husband of her biological mother, Mr. Reichman, an Auschwitz survivor from Łódź, and her two half-biological brothers, the older one, the late Eli Ramon, looking like Romualda, was a miraculous moment in her life. Her encounter with family in Israel was on many levels a life-changing experience, and yet, at the same time, her life has been fully rooted in Polish culture and Polish social environment. Her case shows that the sheer bad luck that accompanied her biological mother Helena in search for Romualda after the war was the decisive moment for the future fate and cultural identity of Romualda. We know from various archival and oral history sources that Helena wasn't the only surviving mother, Jewish parent, who did not retrieve her child in the aftermath of the Holocaust. In spite of tremendous efforts and years of searching for both the children and the rescuers. This is another painful aspect of the post-war history that begs for further investigation. In some cases, these searches have been continuing till now by members of the second generation, cousins and nephews who could only cling to fragmentary evidence and hope against hope that the lost child survivors in their families could be identified and found. Slide number 8, please. Ori Pickles, born in a small leafy green Polish town Tuchola in 1953, emigrated to Israel with his parents in 1957. Ori's father, Józef Pickles, was born into an acculturated, affluent and large Polish Jewish family that you can see on the screen. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Józef Pickles, who was trained as a veterinary doctor, was drafted to Polish army in the rank of lieutenant. Soon after, he was captured by the Germans and spent almost the entire war in a German POW camp in New Brandenburg. While Józef was confined in the POW camp, his brother Victor experienced harsh life conditions in the Lviv ghetto with his young family, with his wife Roma Pickles, whom he married in 1939, Slide number 9, please. And their toddler son, Alexander, born in the Lviv ghetto in the autumn of 1942. Here you see actually the wedding invitation, original wedding invitation of Roma and Victor Bickles. On 4 July 1943, Victor Bickles wrote to Yosef a desperate letter, the last will. He actually knew at the time that Yosef was in the German POW camp. Victor wrote the letter in the shelter when he and his family were hiding for months in the house of a selfless Polish couple, Jan Jurdyga and his wife Henryka, and their 3 young boys. Slide number 10, please. Here you see the Jurdyga family. By 4 July 1943, the shelter in Jurdyga's family house on the outskirts of Lviv was not safe any longer. Neighbors of Jurdyga family began to inquire about the origins of the toddler boy whom Jurdyga family kept above the surface in their house because of Alexander's young age. 1 month after the liquidations of the Lviv ghetto, in June 1943, the Bickles couple asked the Jurdyga to arrange a new shelter for their son Alexander. They believe that he could survive since the toddler boy was not circumcised and had blue eyes and blonde hair. A Ukrainian peasant woman who regularly brought the Jurdyga family milk and butter from a nearby village smuggled Alexander one day with her, and Alexander's parents soon after left their shelter, hoping to move to the east. But at the same time, they were fully aware that their chances of survival were virtually nil. And here's an excerpt of this letter of 4 July 1943, the end of this letter, and I will give you a short quotation from it. My dear Yuzienko, I'm writing my last words to you here. No one survived from our family. Everybody has been killed. People who will give you this letter will explain to you everything. Mr. and Mrs. Jurdygowie, they have a heart of gold. They have been sheltering us till today. They were also the couple who were looking after our boy, but we were forced to give him away into the hands of strangers. In general, please remember to help them and be grateful to them throughout your life. If you locate the boy, please bring him up as if he was your own child. He is the only our descendant. Now I need to say farewell to you. May Almighty God have mercy upon you and the child. The end of quote. Yosef Bickles received this letter only a few years before his death in 1996. Between 4 July 1943 and 1989, the letter was in the possession of Jurdyga family, who in the aftermath of the Second World War, like many other Polish families from the Kresy, were repatriated to the Western territories in Poland. Once repatriated, they searched in vain for Victor and Józef Bickles through international and national Polish Red Cross. After 1989, when diplomatic relations between Poland and Israel were established, the eldest son, Edward Jurdyga, felt compelled to search for Józef Bickles again, and he turned to the Yad Vashem department of the righteous among Gentiles. By then, his parents were also deceased. This is how Victor's letter eventually reached his addressee, Józef Bickles. Ori Bickles, his son, still hopes that someone might know the whereabouts of Alexander, who today would be 79 years old if he is alive. Slide number 11, please. In a similar way, Jack Skowroński, the son of Eliyahu Skowroński, today hopes to find traces of Mira Monet, born in 1938 in downtown Łódź. And you'll see Mira, the baby, here in the arms of her father, David Monet, and accompanied by the mother, Mindla Monet. Both of them parents perished during the Holocaust. What we know from the sketchy information is that in the summer of 1942, Eliyahu, Mira's uncle on maternal side, was responsible for sheltering Mira in a brick factory in Prądnik Czerwony near Krakow. However, someone denounced them and he sent Mira away with a trusted Polish courier to his cousins, the family Rakowski and Banach, who resided in a small town Kazimierza Wielka, 45 kilometers northeast from Krakow. We know that Mira's mother, Mindla, was at the same time in Kazimierza Wielka, and that the mother and the daughter were together till the beginning of the mass murder of the local Jewish community in October 1942. On 8 October 1942, the Germans began the liquidations of the ghetto that lasted approximately a month. Most likely, in the midst of everyday terror between the different actions, Mira was smuggled out of the ghetto with a Pole and placed with a local Polish Christian family. There is a possibility that a headmaster of one of the two local middle schools, gymnasia, hid Mira in his own house and might have adopted her in the aftermath of the war. Mindla's youngest brother, Eliyahu, survived the war, whereas Mira's parents, as I already said, did not. And Eliyahu searched for his niece immediately after the war. He continued to search for her still in the 1960s. On 25th January 1965, he wrote a desperate, emotional letter to the Jewish community in Krakow, asking for assistance in finding his niece. He passed away in 1971. Today, Katarzyna Szuszkiewicz of Anti-Schemes Foundation in Krakow, with the help of a local historian Tadeusz Kozioł in Kazimierza Wielka, is assisting his son, Eliyahu's son, Jack Skowroński, in a hope against hope search for Mira. Mira today, if she is alive, is an 83-year-old woman who might or might not be aware of her painful past and family's origins. She belongs to a group of missing child Holocaust survivors. The fragmentary and blank spaces in the life accounts of these children belong to the history of the Holocaust and to the history of the post-1945 Polish Jews and Polish-Jewish relations. Their cases illuminate the complexities of post-war lives of some child survivors. And I also believe that some of the aspects that I talk about, they refer not only to the Polish case, but other national cases pertaining to histories of other child survivors. It is at this micro level when we touch upon these fragmentary informations, pictures, letters written from within the Holocaust, by parents, letters written after the Second World War, by other relatives, that we can grasp the devastating impact of the war and the Holocaust over children and the multi-generational Jewish families after 1945. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. We've had two amazing, two different presentations. One looking at exclusion and humiliation, and one looking at total loss. And all these stories, they are all the story of the Holocaust. And we are enabling people to ask questions if you ask them in the chat box. Or if you're too overwhelmed, then not. But we will take questions in the chat box, and we have an ability to answer a few. I will take a question from Janine Hawk, and I'll ask both of you this question because Verena works on this in other venues. And the question, Janine writes, how the post-war policies of resettlement made reconstructing family connections so difficult. Can you say more about this? Can we say more? So I'll ask this even wider. Can we say more about the problematics of family reconstruction after the war? We'll start with Verena and then with Joanna, please.
So, I work mainly on this issue of children or relatives searching for children, children searching from their relatives. And of course, the events of the Holocaust had a decisive influence on the post-war families. I mean, Joanna, I think, is more the expert on this. She published a book, but I know from my own research that of course many children had the impression they were left by their families, even though they did not leave them voluntarily. There is this question of guilt and the very subjective feeling of being they know they were taken by force from families, for example, children from the transports, but in the end, they blamed parents for not protecting them enough. But this was a post-war reality. And of course, when they became adults, they understood that this was not a decision that was made by their parents voluntarily, yes? And you know, a boy from Michlic, and he, even though someone adopted him as his own child and could guarantee his survival through Bergen-Belsen and so on, they never had a good connection after the wars. And because this guy was seen lifelong from this boy as the one who was responsible for that his family was murdered. But this was not, of course, there are many psychological reasons, very tragic. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Joanna.
I would like to start with saying that actually the history of the reconstruction of Jewish families would be it would be a very important aspect of educating against other genocides. And in some ways, in my work and also in my teaching, I have done a lot of comparative studies, also the issues of the impossibilities of reconstruction of Jewish family, in looking at also different cases, not only the Holocaust, but as a Holocaust here as a template, understanding the deep fractures, the ruptures that occurred during the Holocaust, and then of course the second ruptures after the Second War. I mean, there are many aspects that we can talk that played a very important role in the complexities of the reconstructions of the Jewish family, and the early post-war period is so crucial to study, to understand the long shadow, the long-term problems of the reconstruction of Jewish family. First of all, you have the geography. As I gave you that example of Romualda, I mean, the movement, the repatriation of Romualda to the Western territories when the mother was still searching her in Kresy, in Wołyń. I mean, the impossibility. So geography played a role. Also the relationship between the rescuers and the children, the survival of the biological parents or not. I mean, that's another key factors. Another aspect that I have written about and in some of my published articles and books in more details. Another aspect which is very important when it comes to understanding the difficulties of the reconstructions of Jewish family is what happened to these children. I mean, especially if they were very young, and that they have grown up for 5, 6, or even longer years in an environment that culturally was different, and religion played a very important role here. Christianity, Catholicism, in these children's identity. that was reshaped during the Holocaust and in the early post-war period. What that meant, that even in cases, and I discussed such cases in more details, I had no times here, but in cases where you have child Holocaust survivors who became ardent believers in Catholicism, we have Christianity. This is also another aspect that important to understand the story. And they emigrate to the West. Some of them, they want to continue to be Christians. And the other members of the Jewish families, the other relatives living in the United States, cannot get that. So then, and even I have one survival in the case where the survival mother cannot get her daughter. She wants that daughter to be the same baby that she plays in the woods, to be taken by a Polish peasant in 1941, and she cannot understand that this daughter, who she reconnects again in 1956, she is a different person, shaped by different experiences. So there are many psychological issues, and I think working actually with psychologists also plays a very important role here for Holocaust survivors. And we as scholars, historians, we actually can document this process also in multi-generational families. And this is the long shadow of the Holocaust and the healing process. We can actually also retrace the different stages of this healing process. And in some cases, this healing process is happening till now, because there is much more openness to such difficult issues today than, let's say, 10, 20, or 30 years ago.
Thank you. I would also like to pitch in, if I may, take the prerogative. I think that to our work, at least what Verena and I am doing in the Children of Holocaust and Genesis project shows that all over Europe, bringing together families is very complicated. Not in what Joanna showed us, that it's complicated to find the people. But like Joanna said now, what happens when they come together? Not even in 56, when they come together 3 years later. And, we can say that in our conferences, there's almost a consensus that it was very hard, close to impossible to reconnect the family. After the Holocaust, children found themselves much better off with their peer groups. To the radical understanding that they will be better off in a peer group home. And children are leaving these families and going to a group home where they live with children like them or teenagers like them. Because rebuilding a family, in the case that that some parts of it were able to reconnect, is very complicated. And the whole issue of families and children, we see this in relatives. I think Boaz Cohen shows that most families of relatives who took Jewish children survivors in the US or in Canada, the relationship didn't succeed and the children moved on to foster homes. It didn't work. It didn't work. So, I mean, there are cases where it worked, but in many cases, it's very, very complicated. And I think this is, Joanna showed this very, very painful story where you don't even find the child or the parent. But we have to admit that even if the parent and the child were found, the tragedies were still there. Nadine, do we have time for? No, so we will end here. Thank you all. I think you should give Verena and Joanna the chat of the talk.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much to Professor Joanna Michlic and to Dr. Verena Buser. And you really opened our eyes to other more to additional painful stories of the Holocaust in which children are protagonists, and we can only say that this is a really important field of study. Joanna is one of the first in this field. We are also doing some work, and other people are doing work, and very slowly but surely we have now a corpus of writing of research, good research on children after the Holocaust. And I think we are only looking at the beginning now. There will be much more coming on. So thank you very much. Maden, what is happening now?
Thank you. Thank you for this incredible panel. I think that we're connecting the dots here, because if the celebration today is 25 years of Yad LaYeled, what actually are we celebrating?